Hello, everybody out there in the internet land. Welcome to our evening of poetry here in celebration of the J.M. Abraham Atlantic Poetry Award. My name is Tanya Davis. I'm speaking to you from Paperclip, Prince Edward Island. I did live in Halifax for a long time, and I'm really happy to be a part of this event and speaking with these poets about poetry and the upcoming awards and everything. So the Atlantic Book Awards are happening very soon on Thursday. So today we're only Tuesday, so that's just 2 days away. This is presented by the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia tonight. And I'm the moderator and the host. I'm going to be asking a couple questions, and there'll be time at the end of the readings and presentations tonight for anyone out there to also ask some questions. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there on Zoom, and you can put the questions in at any point. It's our responsibility to start off by acknowledging the land on which we gather for the Atlantic Book Awards Festival. With the event being held online, we're aware that a singular land acknowledgement does not really capture the richness of our distribution across many locations in Atlantic Canada and beyond. Because the majority of the organizers of the Atlantic Book Awards are located in Scotia, also known as Halifax, we would like to share the Atlantic acknowledgement that is used there. The virtual event was produced in Mi'kmaq, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We recognize the peace and friendship treaties signed by the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq from 1760 to 1769. We are treaty people, and we do have rights and responsibilities as Mi'kmaq and settlers alike. People watching this video from elsewhere are invited to consider their own position with regard to the land where they find themselves. And yeah, I'm speaking from Ipequit, which is Prince Edward Island, also the land of the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. The Atlantic Book Awards will be presented on Thursday, that's June 9th, at the Paul O'Regan Hall in the Halifax Central Library. That starts at 7 p.m. It's hosted by CTV's Lativia Beezer. The awards will also be live streamed, so you can do some more Zooming for book lovers everywhere. To learn more about the gala and all the festival events, you can visit atlanticbookawards.ca, and you can get tickets or access the live stream and just find out more about who's been nominated and what's going on. So I'm going to introduce the authors. Just a reminder, if you have questions at any point, you can just put them in the Q&A, and we're going to leave some time at the end of this presentation. We'll be here for about an hour tonight to answer some of your questions. So I'm going to introduce, we have here, you can see them on your screen. We have Triny Finlay. We also have Alyda Faber and Rebecca Salazar. And they're going to each read some from their books. I have all of their books here. It's going to be backwards on your screen, but they're all very beautiful. They're all very good, and you can find them, I'm sure, at Bookmark in Halifax and many other independent bookstores where you might be tuning in from. So support your local booksellers, buy your books of poetry, because it's just so good to have a book. So without further ado, first up tonight, reading a little bit from her book called Dust or Fire. Is that the book you're... Poisonous if eaten raw, apologies, is Alyda Faber. So she is the author of Dust or Fire, Berlinale Erotic, and the newest Poisonous if eaten raw. Her poetry has appeared in numerous magazines and journals, including Riddle Fence, the Malahat Review, Contemporary Verse 2, and the Fiddlehead. She teaches at the Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax. In this experimental long poem sequence, Poisonous if eaten raw, Alyda Faber transforms the portrait poem into runic shapes, ice-shelved, sculpted, louvered on a winter shoreline. 20 years after her mother's death, Faber untethers herself from the mother she thinks she knows with wild analogies, depicting her mother variously as King Lear's Kent, a Camperdown elm, a black-capped chickadee, Neil Peart, Pope Innocent X, and a funnel spider. That's a lot of things. Alyda, welcome. Thanks for joining us, and go ahead.
Thank you.
And grace us with some of your poetry.
Thank you. I'll read a poem that comes near the beginning of the book and one quite close to the end. Portrait of my mother on the dance floor. His thick knuckled hands conduct the orchestra of his voice. His fingertips tease hers when she hands him cup and saucer, tea with her parents' sisters. A short-lived feral flare, revived some nights and mornings. A ballroom balloons in her throat. They glide skin to fabric sheathed skin. The curtain fall in her mind, sliding waltz steps, the dance floor, her donning a wedding dress. He lifts her, puts her down, gifts her with gold, a watch from Van Vierens on the Voorstreek. He's poor, he says, but his family has money. Something in the new wife plays dead in the teeth of all this wild joy. Likewise, years later, her mind spirals into blackout when the car comes to rest on its roof after a pirouette on ice, and silence dims the wind chimes of the shattered windshield. All she recalls is her hand on the door handle as she uncoils from the front seat and takes his hand. Toe pointed, she feels for the next step on the gravel-studded ice. And the next poem emerged out of a day when it was one of those burning, fire cold days in Halifax, which we don't get that often. But I happened to see from the sidewalk where I was walking on Almond Street, this piece of plastic was just moving over these hummocks of snow in this most graceful way. Portrait of my mother on Almond Street. From the sidewalk, I watch an ocean transparency as it glides. A clear plastic sheet that slides over opaque whiteness, the mogul snow. Queued up along the brick wall, ash trees observe the dancers, the brief happiness of Strauss's Freudensalven. Her unseen partner skims her through flowing turns and uplifts. Her skirts, jellyfish ripples.
Thank you, Ali. It's so nice. I mean, I think one of the great things about the pandemic, if we can say that sentence, I know it's a bit weird, is that we've gotten a little used to being together online and on Zoom. So I feel happy that I get to be here because I'm, across the Northumberland Strait from you all, and it's nice to kind of be at the poetry reading and get to hear your words. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to hear next from Triny Finlay. Triny is a queer poet, writer, teacher, and mother whose collections include Splitting Off and Histories Haunt Us. Her writing has appeared in Breathing Fire 2, Canada's New Poets, Arc Poetry Magazine, Contemporary Verse 2, The Fiddlehead, Grain, The London Reader, The Malahat Review, Plentitude, University of Toronto Quarterly, and Untethered. She teaches English and creative writing at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. Myself, a paperclip. Triny Finlay sketches the internal self and the external whir of the psychiatric ward, laying bare its daily rhythms. Memories, musings, echoes, and meditations on stigma coalesce. Quarters dispensed into a payphone to listen to the stunned silence of a partner. Splenda packets and rice pudding hoarded in dresser drawers. Counting back from 10 as electrodes connect with the temple. Deeply personal and reflective, Myself a Paperclip confronts abuse and experiences with debilitating mental illnesses, therapies, and hospitalizations, all shaped into the remarkable form of a serial long poem. And Triny is going to read us some words now. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Thanks so much to the Atlantic Book Awards for hosting us tonight. So Myself a Paperclip is a long poem, a serial long poem, like Alyda's book. And I'm just going to read a couple of short sections from it. So I'm going to start with Self-Portrait as Paperclip. Bent out of joint in order to hold everything together, won't snap, won't dissolve in an acid bath, but needs to be re-engineered, designed for the shape of the new manuscript it clutches, attached like an infant's latch to a firm, nourishing nipple. Rebent, refined, redefined as a notch maker, page marker, object in place of a memory, as nothing you'd ever find bundled in bulk at Costco. Striking the pen cap against the printed page, you have to look again. This trinket, so ready to be unfastened. The guy in the Johnny shirt grabs 2 packets of social tea biscuits and asks me if I'm a queen too. Sometimes, I say. His reply, sometimes means all the time. I have seen the moments of insidious intent flicker through the neurons' fickle switches. Shred your napkin at every meal. Sprinkle it like salt on pureed squash or mashed potatoes. Shred your cuticles and do the same. I don't want anyone walking on eggshells around me. This body a thumb drive waiting to be plugged in. Don't rush me. An inattentive landlord, strained relationships with our mothers, an everyday sound like, oh. I'm tired of being just a pair of eyes. The freckles are slowly turning to moles. The canker sores arrive. The baseboards of the world cannot contain us. We've turned into hummingbirds, die if we stop moving. Present compulsions, opening and closing the mailbox, wiping the coffee table with Murphy oil soap, eating chickpeas directly from the can. Dare me to make a chart of it. I will not judge the universe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a good ending. I mean, it's hard not to judge the universe. Our third poet of the evening and up for this award on Thursday is Rebecca Salazar. I know these are backwards, but it just feels so nice to hold them up. They're so beautiful. Rebecca Salazar is a writer, editor, and community organizer living on the unceded territory of the Wolustoqey people. Salazar is the author of 2 chapbooks, and her first full-length collection, Sulphurtongue, published by McClelland and Stewart, was a finalist for the 2021 Governor General's Award for Poetry. The poems in Sulphurtongue ask how to redefine desire and kinship across languages and across polluted environments. An immigrant family scatters over a stolen continent. Oracles appear in public transit and online. Bodies are transformed by nearby nickel mines. Doppelgangers, Catholic saints, and polyamorists alike pass on unusual inheritances. Deeply entangled in relations, both emotional and ecological, this collection confronts the stories we tell about gender, queerness, race, religion, illness, and trauma, seeking new forms of care for a changing world. And now we're going to hear from Rebecca.
Thank you, Tanya, and thanks to the other finalists. I'm really happy to be on this list with you. Triny mentored a lot of the poems in this book, and Alyda's book was one that I got to read as a young editor early on in manuscript form. So I'm really feeling like this is a full circle moment to link us all together. I'm going to be reading 2 poems tonight, both of which deal with sexual assault, PTSD, and the way that survivors of sexual violence get treated in public and culturally. I do use a few slurs that are kind of used to turn them on their heads. So if you feel like you need to take a walk while I'm reading, please feel free to do so. The first poem is called Outings. The night I heard Trixie Mattel tell a rape joke, my rapist was outed on Twitter, and how do you follow that act? Trixie says, I miss the days when drag queens could be mean. Like if you left a show early, a queen could just heckle you. Something like, I hope you get raped. And the whole room erupts. Read me, closeted thrift store leather femme millennial, triggered and checking Twitter, sober slumped outside a high school theater, trying not to cry in front of baby gays. Read me, stacking more triggers than Trixie stacks wigs when someone tweets my rapist name into the noise. Like, what about what he did? Who are you, oh subtweet oracle, to spill my filth? Read me, still salty about Trixie as my friends sneak selfies at the highlit photo booth with her so close behind the velvet ropes, they tell me they can smell her. Haze of hairspray, glycol mist, and cotton candy, sweet as days when drag shows weren't full of queer survivors, or they knew to keep the dress code, tits out, trauma tucked. Strike up the feminine, punch down, the show must glow on. Second poem is called Lake Joke, and it owes quite a lot in spirit, not in form, to a poem by Patricia Lockwood called Rape Joke. Except that my book is just in the swamps, very literally a lot of the time. So Lake Joke. The setup is she asked for it, a body rising from the water after months unsearched for. If there is a straight man, he's groping the butt of the joke. When you ask what she was wearing, she will cast it off, trade white cotton for swamp weed and nude bite-bruised skin, munched by brook trout. Wet t-shirt contest of her decomposing chest. You ogle as her slick moon tits wane gibbous, pruned and shrunken. Her cupped skin runneth over with their bounty. Some men don't know another way to get a girl so wet. She still won't smile for you. That whore mouth, once starved for attention, for use, is now busy chewing the scenery. You always wanted her to bring you absolution, then dissolve. Now her laughter rises with her from the water, heralding a flood. Hands off, she gurgles, and wait for my punchline. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm imagining people clapping or doing their soft poetry snaps or hums, wherever they're from. That is something we don't get to hear much on these Zoom rooms, but we can imagine them. And thank you to all of you who are out there on the World Wide Web listening. If any of those poems have sparked questions, do post them in the Q&A and we'll get to them in a few minutes. Or any questions you might have for the poets here based on their other work or themselves, their lives. I have a few questions that I've prepared. I've had a chance to, I got these books in the mailbox, which is a treat in and of itself, getting mail, and not just a internet bill, but a book. So I've got to sit with these books and read through them, and I prepared a couple questions to start us off. But yes, do pipe up if you have any for them, and of course, if any of you you poets keep calling you poets and feeling slightly awkward about it, but you are poets, so I guess it's okay. But if any of you have questions or things to say about the others' poems, this is just an informal discussion, so please feel free. Alyda, I will start with a question I had. I was reading your book and I loved, first of all, how many references were in it towards many kinds of animals. There was cows, sheep, moths, wolves, foxes, herons, goats, wrens. There were probably, I think I missed a couple on that list, and there were lots of nods towards also flora as well as fauna. We had daisies, alums, marigolds, firs. And this book was a lot in reference to your mother. And I guess I'm wondering, and maybe anyone else has thoughts about this, feel free to answer, but how the references to various flora and fauna come into your work, and is that something that you think about consciously? Is it a result of your life and your work in other realms? Or I noticed a lot of it, and it was very moving and beautiful. And I'm just wondering how it made its way into your book.
One of the things that was going on is, since 2014, I was writing mother portraits, and I was always kind of open to being arrested by beauty somewhere, and it could be strange. It could be a slug on a kitchen window, or a moth, or a dead starling. It's like the bird in Are You My Mother is kind of going up to things and saying, "Are you my mother?" And in that book, they all answer no. But in this instance, and see, I have animals too. In this instance, they're all kind of saying yes, no, to me. But it's just being, and sometimes they're sculptures, sometimes they're paintings that just stop me in my tracks. And it was beauty and just wanting to keep looking at whatever, like a quince or the bird in the backyard, or on and on. But it has to do with looking and being stopped by beauty.
That's very interesting. There's a lot of beauty to see if you look, and it's there to be stopped by. You said another thing in one of your poems, which was a portrait of my mother as a black-capped chickadee, which I love those birds. But you did mention about the line was, "I held the sinner's bench, made you the saint, mother and daughter, not enough for each other, but might have been had we looked at each other more." So it's just interesting to hear you speak about the beauty that's there for looking, or that's there if we look at it, and how we can know our mothers, or I guess any of the people around us, if we only were to also look at them.
Well, and also, I just finished reading Alice Britton's book, The Art of Astonishment, and she talks about how every person is a region of darkness, and they cannot be known. And it's the continuous looking is that effort. You look at like an abstract painting or something because you can't see fully. So you keep looking, straining to see more, but it always eludes you.
That's true, which I mean, I think is a thing, could be a thing about our mothers. For as much as we would like to look at them, there's always going to be something that we can't see, and also probably, or arguably, that they can't see about us. It's nice to think of. It's nice to try and see. It's nice to try to see people, and it's nice to be seen. But I do think myself about how we we're both connected on this planet, and also like solitary, and there's only so much we can share. And I think language helps us, and also language can be quite cryptic and hard to get into sometimes. So we can put up lots of walls with language as well. Trini, I loved your book. I loved how much rhyme was what I perceived as rhyme. I mean, as I was reading it, I heard lots of internal rhyme, and rhyme I thought might have been put there on purpose, but I also just loved the rhythm of it. And that wasn't exactly my question, although I am curious to ask you all about what you think about rhyme. Maybe we'll get to that. But I was caught on a line, and I circled it here in my notes, which was, the routines spill their secrets. See how nice it can be setting yourself on repeat. And it both caught me because of that rhyme. See how nice it can be setting yourself on repeat, but then also just that idea. And it does make me think of routines, and some of the routines I gathered from myself a paperclip that might have come up in the psychiatric ward, or just in life in general. And I'm just wondering, it made me wonder how routines helped you or hindered you, and if that was a part of your work or your life now.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think the imposition of routine is what people think will help when one is, suffering mental anguish or going through a depression or whatever type of mental illness you're experiencing. I think there's this sense that, oh, if you would only just wake up at the same time every day and eat lunch at the same time every day and go on a walk at the same time every day, then everything would sort itself out, and you would be more grounded, and you would come back to yourself. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I think it's undeniable that when we take care of ourselves in those more micro ways, in that we make sure we are fed, we make sure we've slept 8 hours, we make sure we've had our 8 glasses of water, like those are routines that do help. But I also think it's pretty reductive to assume that just going on to a routine is the thing that's going to save us from ourselves. So in the psychiatric ward, which is what the book is all about, it's really mainly about being a patient in the psych ward and what that experience is like. I tried to capture this idea that those routines are really enforced, such as, you're out of your bed at 8 a.m., you go into that day room and you're not going back to your room until bedtime. You're not going to spend the day in your room alone. And so in that way, it's less about routine and more about community. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about psychiatric care, because I don't think the general public would think about community as being one of the focuses of psychiatric care, especially inpatient psychiatric care. And for me, that was one of the most interesting and kind of bizarre or absurd experiences of being in the psych ward, which I've been in many times now, is that you're surrounded by other patients at all times. The routine you're forced into is to eat together, to do group therapy together, to do occupational therapy together, making crafts, making other things with your hands. There's this idea that in community, you're going to be helped. And that seems like a paradox for people who are all suffering so intensely, because you would think that might actually result in a kind of communal angst or grief, right? So I think there is something about routine, but there's also something really important about community. And I think the routines on the psychiatric wards I've been on are more about community than they are about just making sure you do the same thing at the same time every day.
Yeah, I think it's true that it's like routine and community. It's a complex thing, and of course it can be challenging to be in a community also that you didn't necessarily choose or curate. But I hadn't really thought of it that way either. Do you still, do you have were you able to have a writing routine, or has that been consistent in your poetic life these days? Is routine a part of how you write?
I'm one of those awful people for whom a writing routine does not work. I can't just tell myself, okay, at 10 a.m. I'll write 5 poems and then I'm done for the day. It doesn't work for me. I'm much more intuitive and go with my moods, which obviously swing. So I'm more inclined to just write when an idea comes to me, and luckily that's fairly frequently. I have, hundreds of notes on my phone for poem ideas, and I just flesh them out when I have time. So I definitely do not have a routine, and I know it feels like there's a division sometimes between poets and fiction writers. Many of the fiction writers I know really do work on a routine, on a schedule for their writing, and they either hit a page count or word count every day, and often they work at the same time every day, and that just does not work for me. So I have other parts of my life where there is consistency and routine, like I have a kid, so that provides some kind of routine for me, right? But I wouldn't say in my writing life that it exists at all.
I think maybe we can't ask ourselves as poets or other poets for a daily word count. That feels mean. Unless, I mean, I'm sure there are poets that do strive for daily word counts. There are all kinds of poets in the world, but I joke with people about how many words I get written in a day, which is sometimes negative words and 1 comma. But I do think routine and lack of it, or the variations upon it, is a very interesting thing to think about writing. And as a writer, I think about it a lot with other people. Of course, comparing myself to them, or just wondering how other people do it. And when I read writers' autobiographies or memoirs, I'm always really, really curious how they get their writing done, and if it involves routine. It's very tricky. Rebecca, I loved also, I mean, I just feel really lucky to be that one of the side effects of getting to moderate this panel tonight is to get to spend a lot of time with these books. And I loved the use of language in your book, and in your poem Homophones. You wrote, and Perro, I think it involves a dog, a word brief and galumphing, puggish growl of the double quick but large pod with the stem of the P wagging into the next line of text. And I was just thinking about how language, besides, we're all speaking about English language books tonight, and these books have largely been written in English, but I was just wondering how words from other languages, in this case Spanish, influence your writing in English, and just how any multilingualism comes into play in your writing, and also just how you think about words, because obviously homophones, as poets, we come up against them all the time. There's lots of various ways that we'll run into a word. So I guess my question in a long-winded way is if Spanish is, or any other language, has influenced your writing in English, and how that is.
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. Thank you. I grew up in an immigrant family, and my parents were kind of like learning English and sort of bits of French as they went. And I started school not speaking much of either English or French, so I don't know how I got by in those early years. But I think what it did was it really made me like aware of how things sound, because English just sounded really discordant and ugly to me at first, which I hated for a long time. And then I eventually started to find that ugliness really fascinating and like something that can easily be played with. I think because Spanish is a lot more, like there are a lot more sounds that repeat, like really similar sounds, and the patterns tend to rhyme a bit more. And like the word stresses kind of have like a very set pattern for the most part. I tried to kind of find that in English, or at times like see like what is it about English that breaks those patterns. And a lot of the poems, and especially the first section of the book, really play with that, I think, because I was trying to kind of come to terms with like losing, partially losing Spanish through not just learning English, but French as well. There's a couple poems that deal with like going to French schools as like an immigrant and hearing sort of like the Francophone struggle with assimilation, but then having to deal with that in a way that was not acknowledged. And just kind of having this like linguistic mash of like 3 different languages kind of fighting for space in my brain, but also in my like written voice. And I think the Spanish really comes through more than anything in like the rhythm and how I think about poetic lines as like a musical thing. I think that's maybe where its influence is clearer, so far as I can tell. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I could sense the rhythm, and I mean, it's one of the reasons I love poetry, and one of the ways that I like to write it is just as a rhythmic vehicle, and I feel like poetry obviously lends itself to that more than some other kinds of writing. I was in Montreal for a little while, for a couple of years, and I'm not quite bilingual. I can speak a little more French than I used to be able to, but I loved the way that my speaking changed while the space was being taken up, as you said, by another language coming in. And maybe Triny and Alyda, you have experienced some of this with there's other languages or ways of thinking, of how, you know, our brains are so malleable, and English language is such a living, changing thing. So there's always influences coming in and new words. And I know maybe some people might find it stressful. I find it very exciting when there's things that muck it up and change it. I guess, yeah, I don't know if I have a question in there, but how do you feel, the 3 of you, about the changingness of English, and where other languages, or there's changing pronouns, there's changing verb constellations. And as a poet, I find it exciting because we can take with it as we will. I feel like there's freedom in poetry that isn't allotted to other kinds of writing. I mean, I think it could be, but in poetry, obviously, we get to do kind of whatever we want. So I feel it's exciting, but does anyone here have any thoughts on that, on our freedom with language and how it can change based on our where we're living or what we're learning?
I guess I could just say that, you know, I love languages, and I studied languages in university, which is a very, you know, ivory tower kind of response. But I did learn Latin and German as an undergrad, and I feel like that, apart from, I also learned Old English later, which surprisingly is almost like learning a whole new language. Like, it is so different from modern English that it required as much work as when I learned German, for instance. And I think what I would say is that because all of those languages that I learned have an influence on English, I felt like I really got to know the English language better through my engagement with like Latin cases and learning what dative is, and learning, you know, just learning how those languages work made me so much more aware of how English works. I also speak French, although I wouldn't say that's as much of an influence on how I think about poetry. I think that the Latin and German in particular, and I guess the Old English too, really helped me feel like I have a sense of where English has come from and where it might be going. And this is all a very kind of Anglophile and Anglophone way of thinking about poetry, but it's certainly where my language influences have come from. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I think as poets, we could probably talk about the intricacies of language for, you know, a whole other Zoom webinars length. I'm going to go to we have a couple questions that came in from the audience in our Q&A. So I'm going to go to a couple of those and see if we can get some answers. I know questions and answers are a fun challenge. I actually love questions. That's one of my favorite things. So this question from BC is for all of you, but for Alyda and Triny in particular, what is it that draws you to the long poem?
Alyda, I feel like I've been talking a lot. Do you want to go first?
I would just quickly say that the long poem is a way of saying this is never finished. So that's my attraction. What I was saying earlier about region, we are all regions of darkness, and the long poem form honors that. I stopped writing mother portraits, but I was not finished.
Yeah, and I will say I have a strong academic interest in the long poem, so I've been researching and reading and working on and teaching about the long poem for many years. I think I've always had this desire to write a book-length long poem. That was my particular goal. Partly because of what a few of the critics say about it, which is like Robert Crouch is all about how a long poem is about delay, and that, like sex, delay is everything. That's what he says. And I love this idea of delayed, not just satisfaction, but delayed everything. So it's like delayed meaning, delayed connection, delayed healing, delay, everything is delayed. And I feel like that was really fitting for a book-length poem about what it's like to lose your mind and then try to get it back again through very conventional treatments that don't always work for everyone. And so for me, the long poem is this kind of expansive space where you can actually play with not just language, but with all the ideas and notions of delay or finding an answer. You don't, right? As Alyda said, you don't find an answer by the end. And it's really important to me too, that be part of the process, that is process oriented and process driven, rather than, I've tied up this little poem with a nice red bow and it fits on one page, So that's my attraction to the long poem.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's true. We ask a lot of questions, or we seek, maybe we seek meaning and understanding, but the actual finding of it is delayed or unending. Rebecca, do you have any experience writing? I mean, some of your poems were long, but I guess like a long poem or a long text like that.
Both yes and no at the same time. I think there's a section in the book, I think it's titled Doppelbanger in the book. It was originally a series of poems, and they're kind of linked, both by process and like theme. They kind of came from a time where I was just having really terrible memory issues. So I was kind of dissociative at the time due to like mental health issues, and I couldn't take the time to write something cohesive. So I kept writing these fragments and just like sometimes a few words at a time and just writing them down on bits of paper or on my phone notes or everywhere. And I think like it kind of like those little fragments that I couldn't turn into one cohesive thing, I later kind of like puzzled together. And this is actually with Triny's help that was done. I did like a studio course as a student with her, and she kind of helped me like through the process of assembling those things into like something that they were all searching for, I guess. Like there was a story there that I didn't know how to tell, and like my brain wasn't capable of telling at that time in any way that I recognized. But even those little fragments were still trying to kind of go towards that. And I think like that section still, like the way that it's placed in Sulphurtongue, I think kind of brings in a lot of those like little like fragments and like things that have been delayed and like questions that are not being answered through earlier sections. And in a really weird way, like I think of it as sort of this like collection of like a hoarder's collection of just pieces of something in attempts to find a whole, but like there's still a story there through those pieces, even if none of them are meant to go together. So I guess that's my roundabout answer to saying that I don't think I've written a long poem, but it kind of could be one.
I think a roundabout answer is the perfect kind of answer to a question about a long poem, which is a very roundabout long thing. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to jump to another question. This is from Andrea. It seems that with all these poets whose work I find so moving, there is an undercurrent or maybe just currents of healing. Is this something you are conscious of as you are writing? And what is the connection for you between writing and healing? Anyone want to dive into that?
I'm happy to go first. Myself and Paperclip is all about healing, at least indirectly, and probably also directly, because it's about finding the pieces of your broken self and trying to put them back together mentally. And part of the thing I wanted to capture in that book is what it's like to receive treatments that then actually add to the mental anguish. So for instance, I had electroshock therapy while I was in a psychiatric ward, and I ended up having very severe side effects from that treatment. So I had severe memory loss, which I'd never regained. But I also lost the ability to read for several months. And for someone whose whole life has been reading and writing, this was like catastrophic, or it felt so at the time. And so part of writing poetry at the time that I was writing about those experiences was about just healing my brain, like healing my actual relationship to language. And it was a short-term memory issue. So my short-term memory was so impacted by the electroshock therapy that I could read maybe 4 words in a row in a sentence, and then I wouldn't remember what I had read 3 words ago. And so reading just made no sense to me. And like I understood individual words, I just couldn't remember enough short term to string them together into any sensical meaning. And so that's one aspect of healing that I really wanted to address in this book. And then the sort of bigger aspect is the thing we all want, which is to heal ourselves of our mental illnesses or to be healed. But that is really never something that happens. Recovery is just, I think, an ongoing process. And I don't think it's something that ever, ends. At least for me, it never has. And the treatments that I've gone through, they're ongoing. Like one thing might work for 2 years and then suddenly it doesn't work anymore, and I've got to try something new. And we've all experienced this probably in our own ways, not necessarily even with mental health issues, but any kind of health issue. It's mutable. These conditions are mutable, and the treatments are mutable too. And particularly in psychiatry, nobody really knows what the hell is going on in the psychotropic medical department, right? Like nobody knows why certain medications work and others don't, and why they work for some people and not for others. And so that's also about healing, because it's about the sort of trial and error that is required, that makes the patient feel like a victim in some ways. And so I feel like there are lots of modes of healing, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in what I'm trying to do. And maybe the bigger picture is, there is a sense of recovery, but it's not actually an end game. It's an ongoing process.
Thank you. Rebecca or Alyda, anything to add about healing?
I would say there's 2 things I could say about this. One, with writing poetry, you're moving into the unconscious, and it's a kind of dreamlike space. And so there are possibilities of healing that you may not touch, that you may not know have healed you. So I like that sense. And the other thing, when I reflected on, it's hard to say what I had done in this book. but one thing I was aware of is giving my mother back her erotic life. And I realized, just realizing that I had done that, why was that important? Because, well, obviously her erotic life gave me life, but it was also her erotic life and choices were a source of immense pain to me, my siblings, and also to her. And so giving that back to her felt necessary. How it is healing, I don't know. Again, it's that space of the unknown that I find so interesting.
That's really beautifully said, Alyda. I keep thinking about how your book in particular has like this, what you were saying earlier about like looking at everything in the world and just asking, are you my mother? And that idea of like the experiment of like, what if I related to this differently? Like, what if I related to a tree as though it's my mother? What if I related to a rock star as though that's my mother? And there's like a reimagination of relationship in that that's really what sticks with me, I think, as a way of like maybe healing either or both of those relations in the same kind of exercise or activity, or dream, I guess. And I think that's a big part of what healing means in my own writing as well. It's that idea of, if this is the injury, how do we live with it and relate with it and like count it among relations? And I'm like drawing here on like a few other writers like Joshua Whitehead, who talks about trauma as like, what if we thought about trauma as kin, as like a family member we have to care for, instead of as like a sort of a demon or like an otherworldly thing or something disembodied. And I just keep coming back to the idea of relations and healing, and that idea that it's never done either, the way that a relationship is never done, even after someone passes, like it keeps going, and like the story keeps going as well.
Absolutely. It does. That's a nice way to put it. We have one more question and we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to put this out here as a final question. This is from Kathy. Kathy asks, do you want your poem to be read and felt, or do you want it to be analyzed like some of us had to do in school? Good question. Thoughts?
I'm gonna give a really bisexual answer here and say, why not both? I think, yeah, you can do all kinds of things with a poem, and I think coming back to it and approaching it in different ways can be really rewarding as well. There are poems that operate with their form first, or poems that operate with their feeling first. But that doesn't mean that they're not doing the other things. So letting a poem hit you however it wants to hit you and asking like what it's doing is, I think, more interesting than like deciding how, like imposing a particular approach. Just like take one however it comes to you, and then like try again and see what changes, and try again and see what changes, and what else you can kind of find in the layers of it.
Yeah, I agree with Rebecca. I think there are so many different ways to experience poetry. And I think so many people grow up being taught that poetry is a puzzle they need to decipher. And that's a really harmful way of thinking about poetry in my mind. And it's one that I think lots of us who teach at universities try to, change for our students if we can, because there's so much to this idea that what the reader experiences when reading a poem is just as valid and just as important emotionally and affect wise as all these other analytical tools that we've grown up sometimes being exposed to as a way of deciphering that puzzle that's been presented to us. So I think the analytical is going to come at some point, probably for most poetry readers. I mean, it's a limited audience anyway, right? So the people who are seeking out poetry are probably already thinking about poetry in different ways than maybe a general reader. That's my perhaps biased opinion. But the idea that the poem can be felt and the reader's reaction is important, and all of those things are deeply, deeply influential to me. And you know, I think one of the things that these three books have in common is that they do evoke a very strong emotional reaction in the reader. It's material that's elegiac for all of us, I think, in some ways. Like there's a lot about loss and absences in all three of the books. And I think that's a really emotional space or territory to be occupying in poetry. And I really love that about these three books.
Alyda, any closing thoughts on that?
I agree with my esteemed panelists. I would just add to that that feeling is a way of thinking with the writer. And also, I just want to put a word in for editors, the many people who have read, like really teased. The analogy I used for Ross Lecky's work with my poems is there are poems where he just starts taking the car apart and we just look at all the parts of the engine. He just has this incredible talent for that kind of analytic reading, as well as moving into the feeling. And Stephen Heighton, with whom I worked as well, sadly no longer with us. He too, just this just fine-tuned analysis, but the feeling was never left behind with that kind of analysis. So, yeah.
It's good to close up the night acknowledging all the poetry mechanics out there in the world who are editing these words and these books into being. I would like to just say thank you to everyone who's been with us tonight. Thank you to the Nova Scotia Writers Federation and Atlantic Book Awards. A reminder that the Atlantic Book Awards are Thursday, June 9th. You can tune in online, or if you're in Halifax, or at the Paul O'Regan Hall in the Central Library. They start at 7 o'clock, and I'm really excited to see what happens, and I'm sure all you are. I wish you the best of luck, and I'd really like to thank our panelists for sharing their poems and their words and thoughts. Triny Finlay, Alyda Faber, and Rebecca Salazar. It's been a real treat and a real honor to get to be here and hang out with you tonight for poetry and everything. So thanks again so much.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your very thoughtful engagement with just the questions and the questions you asked. Really appreciate it. And also Trini and Rebecca, really appreciate what you had to say.
My pleasure, absolutely.